Good morning. Good morning. I feel like I'm in class. Welcome, everyone. This is the 24th annual South Texas Law Review Symposium. And this year we're talking about a topic which, frankly, no one cared about 6 months ago, or maybe 8 months ago. The Foreign Emoluments Clause. It provides no person holding any office of profit or trust under them, and that means the United States, shall, without the consent of Congress, accept of any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. This is a clause in the Constitution which is obscure. It has played almost no role in constitutional law for the last 2 centuries. Yet, as soon as the election of 2016 wrapped up, I knew it would become pressing. So shortly after the election, I went to Dean Dennis, who's the advisor of the Law Review, and I said, let's do a symposium on the Foreign Emoluments Clause. And she probably thought I was crazy. But I said, look, this is going to be big. And there's going to be litigation, there's going to be scholarship, and South Texas can be at the cutting edge, the vanguard of that movement. And indeed, we jumped the game. Because as we were planning the symposium, litigation was filed in New York, in the District of Columbia, in Maryland, and elsewhere, asserting that the president is receiving unconstitutional foreign emoluments. Our panels today represent the best of the best. I don't say that because I'm on it, but we have some really good speakers who will give you everything you need to know about the Foreign Emoluments Clause. And eventually we'll publish a book, a volume of articles that will, I'm certain, be cited for years to come. In the morning, we have 3 presenters. First, Andy Grewal from the University of Iowa will be discussing the Foreign Emoluments Clause and the Chief Executive. Second, we'll have Professor Zephyr Teachout beaming in from New York by Skype. And Zephyr will be talking about 2 kinds of rules. After a short break, we'll have James Phillips and Sarah White. And they will talk about the meaning of emoluments in 18th century American English. A corpus linguistic analysis. This is cool stuff, corpus linguistics. If you don't know what this is, get used to it. This is a new, it's like a new big thing in originalism. And then Andy, James, and Sarah will be discussing a panel discussion. I encourage you to bring your A-game questions because the things you ask here, you'll probably read about in the news at some point in the future. Over lunch, we're very fortunate that Justice Mark Brown of the 14th Court of Appeals will be giving us a keynote ethics lecture. We can all use the discussion on ethics. In the afternoon, we have another 3 presenters. First, Professor Seth Barrett-Tillman, all the way from Ireland, will be here. And his paper is titled Karl Popper's Falsifiability, the Foreign Emoluments Clause, a debate between constitutional Eloi and constitutional Morlocks. I don't know where I fall in that spectrum, hopefully somewhere in the middle. After that, Jane Chong will be here. She'll be talking about limiting the president to protect the executive, lessons from the lessons from the emoluments debate, and Jane is an editor at Lawfare. And last and most certainly least, me, I will be talking about original defiance and later acquiescence. Then Seth, Jane, and I will have a discussion, and I'll give some concluding remarks. I'd like to recognize the people who helped make this symposium possible: Dean Elizabeth Dennis, Adam Bateman, the editor-in-chief of the Law Review, Fanny, where are you? Of course, Fanny's the symposium editor. She's not here. She's running around doing everything, but Fanny Tercios has been a fantastic editor, and I have to especially commend them. There's been a hurricane last week. And I got this frantic email from Fanny saying, do we cancel? And we said, no, we're going to plow through, and I'm grateful that we did. And we have a packed house. Everyone's here. I'm very grateful to see that. For all the editors in the Law Review, thank you for your hard work. It's the case that the editor never gets the credit they deserve, right? Because the person who's name goes to the article, gets all the credit. But professors, we know that unless students edit these journals, we don't have articles. And you are part of a very long institution. It's been 24 years that we've had the symposium, even longer having the law review. You are building another block in that institution. And one day, when you have your office and your law office, you have the wall that South Texas Law Review, that's something you can show to be proud of. It's going to be very proud of. So without further ado, I will shut up. And I will invite Andy to the front of the room to kick off our presentation. And please, I encourage you to ask lots of questions. You don't have the opportunity to pick the brains of some of these scholars all the time. So, Andy, and I think we have an introduction first. Yeah. All right, come on up. Thank you all so much. And I'll sit down and shut up now.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Shannon Baldwin, and I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Andy Grewal. Mr. Grewal's presentation explores whether and to what extent the activities of the Trump Organization established that President Trump has violated the Foreign Emoluments Clause. Professor Grewal joined the Iowa faculty in 2011. Prior to teaching at Iowa, Professor Grewal taught at Arizona State University. Professor Grewal's scholarly interests relate to the intersection between tax, administrative law, and statutory interpretation. Previously, Professor Grewal practiced in the Washington, D.C. area, and is currently at Iowa Law. So please join me in welcoming Professor Grewal.
Thank you, everyone. Figured out how it works. So I'm going to talk about the Foreign Emoluments Clause, and technically my paper does quite a bit with the Trump Organization, although I'll probably leave specific analysis of the president's business dealings to Q&A. My hope is to give you just kind of a legal background on the meaning of emolument under this clause. Josh had read this, but if you want to see it on the screen, you see that this clause says that the U.S. can't establish noblemen or noblewomen. And for our purposes, we're concerned with this language saying that no person holding any office of profit or trust, which apparently arguably includes the president, shall, without asking Congress, accept any presents, emolument, that's what I'm going to focus on, office, title, of any kind, whatever, from a foreign state. So there's different elements to this clause. I'm going to focus on what does this word mean, emoluments. I mentioned as a threshold question, it's unclear whether the president is actually covered by this language. And I know that Professor Tillman and maybe Professor Teachot will dig into that. I just want to say one word about that issue. I suppose it's a high stakes issue, and it was very well debated between Professor Tillman and Professor Teachot in the pages of the Northwestern Law Review a few years ago. Both sides are very scholarly. And now if you look at this issue, don't go on Twitter, but if you do,
Don't go on Twitter.
you will see just people responding through name calling and things of that sort. And I think that's unfortunate, just because it is a very interesting issue, whether the office of the presidency is an office of profit or trust under the United States. Normally I'd go a little bit more into that, but I think you're going to get your fill of it. I just want to emphasize that there's good scholarly discussion, and I'm frankly disappointed by the decline in discourse regarding that issue. All right, regarding my issue, the meaning of emolument, if you just picked up a dictionary, you'll see two definitions, and these two different definitions form the core of the controversy that you see in the lawsuits between Congress and President Trump, Maryland and D.C. versus President Trump, and CREW, that advocacy organization in D.C. and President Trump. And so if you pick up one dictionary, there's many who may flip the word of this. Under one definition, emolument means whatever you get from performing your duties in connection with being an officer or employee, and things of that sort. So salary would be an obvious emolument, maybe pensions, things of that sort. A second definition would be profit, advantage, gains in general, something very nebulous, just any type of benefit possible. And so the challengers to President Trump are taking that second definition and saying that, well, anytime President Trump gets any type of benefit, whatever, from any king, foreign state, or so on, he has violated this clause absent congressional consent. So a trademark granted from China, a liquor license granted to a golf property, diplomatic stay at the Trump hotel property. All of these would fall under this, I suppose, catch-all definition of profit advantage gains in general. So essentially, President Trump, under their approach, would be in constant violation of the Foreign Emoluments Clause from the very first minute that he took office, because presumably even on January 20th, some foreign government official solicited the Trump hotel property. They may have been staying there for the inauguration balls, or a foreign official played golf at a golf course in Scotland, and so on. So under their definition, it's surely the case that President Trump would have violated this clause. Under the other definition referenced before, just to hammer it down a little bit further, the Supreme Court has described in the non-constitutional law context, has described this word emoluments as embracing every species of compensation or profit derived from the discharge of duties of an office. Under this definition, if someone goes into the Trump Tower Grill and buys a taco bowl, that has nothing to do with hiring President Trump as a consultant, employee, and so on. Such that transactions of that sort, they may be gains in general, and that's the second definition, but under this first definition, an office-related definition, there would be no violation. This word emoluments is a somewhat funny word. We don't use it so much anymore. It's not non-existent, but it's certainly not popular. Historically, it has been associated with perhaps sometimes funny perks associated with an office. If you were an officer in the Army, you would have a servant or forage for your horses. Or if you're the sheriff of a particular area, you may have the right to slaughter cattle. If you were a tax collector, as opposed to being paid a salary, you retain 1/4 of 1% of all the taxes you collected. So this word emolument is historically associated with compensation related to your official position. And you may wonder, well, why? Isn't that just salary? That's because officers historically were compensated through means other than $100,000 a year. And that probably also explains, or may explain, why we don't hear it anymore. Starting around the early 1900s, the U.S. shifted to a salary model for its officers, rather than giving IRS agents or the predecessor agents a portion of taxes that they collected, as opposed to saying that the court clerk keeps 10% of the filing fees collected. We switched to a salary model for government employees and officers. And having switched to a salary model, this word emoluments referring to things like right to slaughter cattle, keeping a portion of the taxes collected, may have fallen out of use. That's my guess. That's my guess as to why we don't use the term anymore. Because emolument was associated with a funny type of compensation associated with an office. And now, if you're the Secretary of State, you get a salary, pension, parking pass, maybe, things of that sort. So we don't really need the term emolument anymore. All right, so which of these two definitions wins out? And under one, surely diplomatic stays, hotel receptions, bank loans, rental payments, everything and anything. Diplomat comes in and orders a taco bowl, bam, impeach President Trump. Under another one, it's more, well, is a foreign government actually making President Trump their Secretary of State? Are they actually hiring him as a consultant? Are they providing him compensation for services provided? Well, starting with one source, right, which I think is the most important source, it's legal authorities. Essentially, every single person who has ever thought about this issue until November 2016 said that emolument under the Foreign Emoluments Clause means compensation associated with your official position. Every single one. If there was a contrary authority, you would see them screaming it off the rooftops. The only authority contrary, again, if you pick up a dictionary, you may see a different definition. But every single person who's ever thought about this issue, at least in a legal document, legislative branch opinions, executive branch opinions, congressional enactments, statutes, and so on, and even a phantom 13th Amendment, has assumed or implied or directly stated that emolument under the Foreign Emoluments Clause refers to paying someone for compensation. So let's start with that 13th Amendment, which is pretty interesting. Now, I said that we saw that the clause as written applies to officers of the United States. In 1812 or 1810, Congress proposed to greatly expand this clause. It said that if any citizen accepted an emolument of any kind whatever from a foreign government, that person shall cease to be a citizen of the United States. Apparently, Napoleon's little brother married a very fancy American woman, had a child, and people were worried, well, the French are going to take over American society. That may have been one of the motivations for this. Let's think about, would it make sense to say that emolument means any benefit of any kind imaginable if emolument means, if we apply it to this amendment? So any citizen who accepts any emolument of any kind whatever just loses citizenship, absent the consent of Congress. This would mean that if you're a U.S. person in Virginia and a foreign diplomat ambassador buys tobacco from you, done. You lose your citizenship. You own a tavern, the Trump Tavern. I don't know. Because his family came in the 1900s, or maybe there's somebody else with the last name Trump right then. You would lose your citizenship just because an ambassador stayed with you. Why would anyone propose such a thing? Now, I suppose crazy amendments or statutory amendments are floated all the time, but this was no oddly received amendment to the Constitution. Both houses of Congress, as part of the proposal, passed by very wide margins. Both houses of Congress had persons who were involved in the framing or ratification of the Constitution. And then 10 states quickly ratified this. Pennsylvania was so certain that this was going to go through, they just went ahead and included it in their laws. Well, of course this is going to go through. This makes perfect sense. Why would Americans agree that they should lose their citizenship just for selling tobacco to a foreigner? Or, if there was a trade in government securities, why would any person who held a British bond lose his or her citizenship on account of receiving an interest payment from the UK related to that security? It seems strange. And why would both houses pass it? Why would 10 states quickly ratify it? It even got to the point that it was so obvious this was going to be adopted that people assumed it was. The United States statutes at large included this. That's an official compilation of U.S. laws. Finally, in 1815, a congressman said, hold on, I don't think this has been ratified. Let's investigate. And Congress did an investigation and found out that, in fact, it was not ratified. But until the late 1800s, many people assumed that this was law. That there's no evidence of ambassadors freezing to death or starving to death because they couldn't go to any tavern in rural Virginia. So if we look at this amendment, which again uses this phrase emolument of any kind, whatever, if we read emolument to mean anything imaginable, this doesn't make any sense. Alternatively, if we read it in accordance with the other definition, that is, you can't be hired by a foreign government, then it makes perfect sense. You lose your citizenship if you, an American citizen, go serve as an officer in Napoleon's army, or the Secretary of State for Britain or their counterpart. So that's one authority. Congress assumes the foreign orientation of emoluments. Sorry, compensation, according to definition. Right now, people are concerned about President Trump, but probably the biggest group of persons for whom this is an issue are military personnel. Military officers are nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and after about 20 years, many go into retirement, but they can be recalled into active duty. And because they can be recalled to serve their country, they retain their title as officers, retired officers. And for them, it's an issue. If you spent 20 years living abroad, as many service personnel do, you may want to keep living there. But if you're living in Australia, you can't live off of your military pension alone, so you may want to be a school teacher in Australia. This poses an issue because working for a foreign government, Australian government, in a public school, that, even under the first definition of emoluments, would violate the Constitution. So Congress, to solve this problem, passed a statute saying that we consent to our retired military personnel accepting civil employment and the related compensation for these officers. Now, if emolument means anything imaginable, then what good does this statute do? If you're an officer, a retired officer, and you're working and living in Australia, Brazil, and so on, surely you're going to derive some benefits from that foreign government other than just your straight salary from the public school. Your tax deductions, or maybe you need to build something on your house and you get a permit, or maybe you have a side business and you get a business permit. If emolument really means anything imaginable, Congress has essentially consigned our foreign officers, or retired officers, to inevitable constitutional violations. But nobody, they didn't even dream of assuming that emolument meant such a thing. We understood that emolument means compensation for services. So if we want to solve this problem for you, we're going to pass a statute and say, go ahead, go work for a foreign country. They didn't even think to say, well, you can sell a taco bowl to a foreign government. There's different statutes along those lines. Office of Legal Counsel, which provides definitive guidance to other branches within other agencies within the executive branch, also assumes similarly. Very interesting case of a German who was a judge in Germany, and the Nazi regime comes in and kicks all Jews from these civil service positions, including this judge who was Jewish. And after the war, as part of, I suppose, the conciliatory efforts, Germany decides to pay pensions to people who lost them. This judge was, I'll say, a judge for 10 years and would have been entitled to a pension on account of his service. And Germany also paid these persons who were getting kicked off a fixed sum, let's just say $5,000. And an issue arises because this displaced Jewish judge was now a DOJ official, United States Department of Justice. So a question arises. This person is a DOJ official, apparently holder of an office of profit or trust, and he's about to get paid from the foreign government, Germany. Can he accept this apparent emolument from a foreign government? Well, the Office of Legal Counsel analyzes it and says, well, emolument means compensation for services rendered. If Germany is giving you $5,000 for the tort, the nature of a tort, therefore you can accept that amount. Regarding the pension, again, remember he served for 10 years. The OLC says, well, part of a pension is payment for services. You earn part of it, at least, through performing services. So part of your pension actually is covered by this clause. He actually served 10 years, but they paid him as if he was never kicked off the bench. 25 years. So they gave him a 25-year pension as opposed to a 10-year pension. They said, well, the portion for 10 years, you earned that by working. That's a prohibited emolument. The other 15 is more than the nature of a tort. Comptroller General made similar legal conclusions. They actually decided that all payments were excluded, the full pension and so on. But for our purposes, on this legal definition, the term emolument, since it's modified by this very broad phrase of any kind, whatever, was intended to cover compensation of any sort arising out of an employment relationship with the foreign state. To adopt Larry Tribe's definition, they should have just stopped and said this is intended to cover benefits of any sort, and that's the end of it. But that's not what they did. They said, well, if you're getting money from a foreign government, let's cut it up. Let's try to figure out what part is paid as compensation for the services provided. That's prohibited. What part isn't? That's not covered by the clause. This word emolument, I think under the Foreign Emoluments Clause, under every single anytime there's been a definition, it's related to this employment compensation context. And there's a couple other clauses in the Constitution that use this term, And under both, I think it's very clear that the framers, ratifiers understood emolument to mean compensation for services. So under the legislative emoluments clause, no legislators essentially can assume an office, Secretary of State or something like that, if while they were legislators, the compensation, the emoluments associated with that office have been increased. So they don't want Congress passing a statute saying that the Secretary of the Treasury shall get $20 million a year, and then pressuring the president to appoint their buddy Ted Cruz, who they all love. I'm in Texas, I guess that joke doesn't matter. My impression is he is not one in love. Like, we're in Texas. Not about it. Anyway, this clause contemplates that if the emoluments of an office have increased, a legislator can't jump into that office. So this was an issue for Justice Hugo Black. He was part of Congress, at which point the Supreme Court received a retirement pension by congressional act. Congress passed a statute saying that justices who attain the age of 70 years old are entitled to a pension equal to the salary they had while serving. And as part of Justice Black's confirmation hearings, some senators said, what's going on here? Senator Black is a senator, and now, being a Supreme Court justice, entitles you to a pension. In other words, they were arguing that the emoluments of being a Supreme Court justice have went up. So that was one side. And in connection with that argument, they referred to the Supreme Court case I described before, but it said that emoluments are everything related to an office. And other legislators were very skeptical. They said, well, okay, do you really mean anything related to an office is an emolument? These are examples from the legislative record. They're making fun of this guy. They're saying, well, what if we passed a statute giving Supreme Court justices softer chairs rather than harder ones? What if we installed air conditioning in the Supreme Court building? What if we added to the number of secretaries that serve the justices and court staff? Are those all emoluments? Well, eventually Justice Black was, of course, confirmed. Point being, for our purposes, you look at the debate, nobody even suggested that emolument meant anything imaginable. Even the fiercest critic of this appointment limited his argument by saying emoluments relates to all compensation for an office and a pension is so described. Others did not challenge that definition. They were just perhaps viewed a pension more in the nature of a gift as opposed to an emolument. Again, nobody said that, if you get any benefit imaginable from the U.S. government, that's emolument. This word emolument appears one more time in the Constitution. Provision that applies specifically to the president. It says the president gets a fixed compensation and no other emolument from any individual state or from the United States. You don't want Kansas passing a statute and giving the president another $75,000 as an incentive to provide the Kansas special treatment. For Reagan, this was an issue because he was previously governor of California, and he was entitled to a pension on account of his service as California governor. And he becomes president, and advocacy groups say he's violating the Constitution. Ultimately, this clause is worded a little bit differently from the Ford one. This clause is contemplating that the president shall receive for his services as president a fixed compensation and no other emolument. And in light of that language, the Comptroller General says that this may be a benefit, this may be compensation, but it's not for his services as president. This relates to his services as California governor. In doing so, both the Comptroller General and the Office of Legal Counsel did not doubt that emolument means compensation for services. The question was, is this compensation for services as president or as California governor? And nobody even dreamt that, there's any benefit imaginable from California. You get the state tax deduction regarding his home in Southern California is violating the Constitution. No one even thought to think of that question, even though, given his ties to California, surely he had some type of benefit continuing from the California government. So, I'm supposed to summarize. We accept this definition. It's embodied in every single legal authority. Again, you will not find a single legal authority anywhere saying that emolument means anything imaginable. And for President Trump, we would determine whether any payment he received from a foreign government is attributable to a service relationship between him and that government. Notably, when I say office-related compensation, this is a source of confusion. I'm not referring to exploitation of office generally. I'm not referring to, these authorities aren't referring to either profiting off the presidency. That is not something that the Foreign Emoluments Clause is geared towards. How do we know that? Well, I guess I'll just quickly summarize again. If emolument meant profiting off your official position, well, how do you make sense of this 13th Amendment? It applies to all citizens. The vast majority of citizens don't have an office in order. Are they excluding being a U.S. citizen? It wouldn't make sense. The office that is being referred to, when you look at the list of prohibited items, cannot accept from a foreign government a present, pension, office, secretary of the country, or emolument from that foreign country. So the issue is, are you engaged in a services relationship with a foreign country and being paid for that service? Are you getting compensation for your position under foreign law? And if every authority squarely considered it, would say similarly. Sometimes you have war veterans. There was a comptroller general opinion where somebody worked for the British Army for a number of years and then is a DOJ official. And this person was prohibited actually from accepting his war pension, not because the British, by paying him a war pension, were trying to bribe him as a DOJ official, but because they were paying him for his services during the war. I mentioned Army examples. You're a pilot in the Air Force and you retire, and you want to go work as a school teacher, teaching art, something that has nothing to do with what you did for the U.S., absent statute, and now we have a statute, but absent statute, that's prohibited under the Foreign Emoluments Clause. So, profiting off the presidency may be relevant to this domestic clause, this other clause. You're not supposed to get special compensation from the states or from the United States with respect to your official U.S. position, the presidency. But the foreign clause has a different orientation. You don't get hired by a foreign government. Okay, so this analysis, my analysis, is focused on these published legal authorities, very largely textual approach. There are, of course, different ways to interpret the Constitution. One could invoke purposes. We're in law school, if you want to do law and economics, law and philosophy, go ahead. What would happen if we were going to analyze this clause with respect to its purpose? I'm not a purposivist, but my understanding is that you would say that this was geared towards anti-corruption, and any payment that has a propensity to influence a federal official should be prohibited by that clause. I have no problem with somebody saying that. I think it's good. You want to take purpose-based approach, textual approach, originalist approach, living Constitution approach, law and economics approach. That's great. I do think that if that's what you're doing, you should be clear about it. If you want to argue again, if you want to argue that this clause is about preventing corruption and therefore who cares if Trump is accepting compensation or not in his capacity as employee, if Kuwait has a reception at the Trump Hotel that raises a conflict of interest question, that's fine. That sounds accurate. But if you're going to make that argument, acknowledge that you are pushing the purpose of the clause, not the text in every legal authority, and also acknowledge that that's not how some legal authorities address the question. It is surely the case that in these various opinions, at times they refer to the purpose or the spirit of the provision. I'm not denying that. But there's also various opinions that say that this clause doesn't turn on the existence of any actual conflict of interest. Even when it's clear that this person would not be tainted, this federal official would not be tainted by accepting a position with a foreign government. The LLC says that, well, look, we know that you're a nice guy, you're not going to be conflicted. The clause says what it does. So if you're going to push the purpose-based approach, I think that's great. Say you're doing that, and acknowledge that that's not how this clause has been interpreted. Right? They do mention the purpose, but you will not find something saying that the key to interpretation is the purpose. Instead, you have these textual definitions, and they'll say things like our analysis is buttressed by the purpose. Even things that clearly can't violate it. Rutherford B. Hayes got a miniature canoe, could fit in your hand, essentially worthless, from an Indian tribe, and Congress gets worked up over it. It seems odd, and now today it seems quaint, because apparently our current president has millions of dollars from foreign governments, and I fully agree that that raises conflict of interest questions, but that's different from saying something's unconstitutional. And I probably wouldn't have written this paper if Tribe and so on had not presented the arguments the way they did. And this, as Josh pointed out, nobody knew this existed until November 9th. And then, as part of the faithless electors movement, as part of the push to get the electors to vote for somebody other than Trump, they put together this paper saying that the text, history, purpose, everything imaginable establishes that this clause prohibits any type of transaction with foreign government. It was presented in such strong terms. Well, I was very put off by them, motivated to write this paper. But if someone just wants to adopt a purpose-based approach, then that's great. Just acknowledge what you're doing, and courts can decide. And there's obviously many constitutional provisions that have been interpreted in a very purpose-based fashion. There's nothing wrong with making that argument. It's not my preferred approach, but it's wrong. Another line of analysis we've seen relates to historical, but historical, kind of scare quotes here. There's been studies saying that, out of 42 out of 47 founding era dictionaries, that the first or only definition related to emoluments is that broad one, that emolument means all gains of any sort, whatever. I personally don't care too much about that. Why is that? Well, let's say somebody's sitting at a computer, scrambling, and says, I need a mouse. Okay? To figure out what he needs, I wouldn't go on the street and say to 100 people, say, draw me a picture of a mouse. Presumably all or nearly all of them will draw a picture of a little rodent. If you pick up dictionaries, they're all going to probably list the rodent, the animal first. Telling me that one word means something 84% of the time means that it means that thing 100% of the time seems very strange to me. So it's not debatable that at the time the Constitution was ratified that this word emolument had multiple meanings. And if it's shown that a lot of people, and I hope I'm not spoiling the next paper, you guys can give me your thoughts in response. They're going to do a historical usage of the term. I want to know what this word means in the particular legal context that it's used. I don't want to know what 90% of the people think, unless they're using that word in that particular context. So, sure, I haven't reviewed all these founding era dictionaries, but 33 of them list the tribe definition first, and one I'm offering second. Big whoop. I'm concerned about what it means in the context of the Constitution. I think after analyzing various legal authorities, it's perfectly fair to think about consequences of a particular interpretation. And if they're right, basically everyone is going to have violated the Constitution. If it's right that any benefit imaginable comes within this word emolument, I bet I could find a violation for every president. Our former president, Barack Obama, received several $100,000 in bonds on Treasury securities. And if emolument means any benefit, then under the domestic emoluments clause, that was unconstitutional. President Trump, it is alleged, violates a clause when foreign networks show The Apprentice. Those four government-owned networks pay NBC a royalty, and NBC pays something to Trump. That's their complaint. That violates the Constitution. Well, if a foreign government, foreign library buys Dreams for My Father, pays a royalty to the publisher, and that's passed to Barack Obama, that's also going to violate the Constitution under that definition. Under the domestic clause, the State Department bought $70,000 worth of Obama's books. It's a big pile that they give out to other people. This may raise conflict of interest questions. Maybe you don't want particular presidents, Trump or Obama. Obama made $16 million off of 20 foreign copyrights and a U.S. copyright. Perfectly fair conflict of interest question, but it makes me skeptical that it's unconstitutional. And again, we focus so heavily on the president, but it's been applied much more broadly. At one point, under the Reagan administration, it was believed that this clause applied to everybody. So that would mean that if you were just a government employee in D.C. and you own a flower shop with your wife or husband, and an embassy orders flowers from you, bam, you violate the Constitution. It will essentially mean that everybody is violating the Constitution. And maybe it's a case that the Constitution really makes everything unconstitutional. If that's what the Constitution said, then we have to amend it. But when every legal authority adopts a different definition, and when the consequences of the alternate interpretation are so severe, I think it makes sense to buttress our analysis regarding the commonly understood definition. This also goes to recovery. We think that prior officials are in the clear, but historically the remedy for a foreign emoluments clause violation has been to sue the government official. The government sues that person, takes action against him or her, and says, give us back the money you took. Oh, you've got $20,000 as a school teacher in Australia? You shouldn't have taken that. Give it back to us and put it in the treasury. So if this lawsuit prevails, then consistent with his constitutional obligations, President Trump should sue Obama, sue Clinton, Secretary of State, start suing federal officials left and right, and get all the money back. And if that's what the Constitution requires, we're stuck with it, and that's the correct result. But I'm very skeptical that that is so. I'm going to stop there. The paper goes ahead and applies this to various types of transactions within the Trump organization. I prefer if we have 5-6 minutes left. 5 minutes. If you have questions, I prefer to hear your concerns rather than keep talking. No questions. I was so overwhelmingly convincing.
Yeah, last question. So Andy, this is everyone hear me? Yeah. So this is a general question I'll probably come over and over again. Maybe Gene will talk about it later. But so many of our precedents were premised on having a president that behaved in a normal fashion. What do we do when we're confronted with a president that defies all norms on a daily basis in 140-character bursts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's, like you said, it's a general question. I mean, ultimately, you can't legislate ethics perfectly, but it doesn't matter what's in the Constitution or statute if Congress, courts, and the president is corrupt. I mean, it's impossible. So I'm not going to change the meaning of the Constitution on account of the whims, I suppose, of one office holder. I think every president is conflicted. It'd probably be the rare individual, if such a person exists, where his or her desires perfectly matched what was best for the country. And I think this president raises questions as to how serious he is about the job, but I would not let that affect my legal interpretation. I'm supposed to pursue other remedies, ballot box being the primary one. Yep.
So, many justices of the U.S. Supreme Court have written books, and many of them hold stock. Would they, under the broad sense, the tribe sense of emoluments, be in violation of the Constitution?
Yeah, so one threshold question is whether the foreign emoluments clause applies to persons in the judiciary, the judges themselves. Under one view, some believe that. And if that's the case, then if Stephen Breyer's Act of Liberty was copyrighted in Canada, that would be unconstitutional for all the reasons that Trump's trademark for toilets in China is. If it really is just a strict rule that any benefit imagined was unconstitutional, then anybody, plenty of members of Congress who, I guess their books aren't all that widely read, but maybe Canada or Mexico will have granted them a copyright, just as they did for Barack Obama. And under that definition, yeah, it has to be. Other questions?
I was wondering if, under your interpretation, if a president has children who are taking over his company or working in his government, would they be able to violate this clause?
Yeah, so that goes to the threshold question. Assume your hypothetical question. Again, nobody knows exactly what the law is on this issue, who holds an office of profit or trust. If you told me that the law was the Reagan administration's interpretation, if that was the law, as opposed to one branch's interpretation, then yeah, anybody who's working for the federal government is covered by the Foreign Emoluments Clause. Under the Obama administration's view, which I think is more realistic, the Obama administration repudiated the Reagan administration and said, you know what, office of profit or trust in all likelihood means people who are appointed through the Senate's confirmation process. Those are the persons who hold an office of profit or trust in the U.S. They wield some portion of governmental power. Unpaid advisor or just an advisor in the White House would not be so described. It's not a settled question, but that would be the threshold question. And then, yeah, it's conceivable that Ivanka or Jared could apply the same analysis. Are they working for a foreign government as opposed to just, what does she sell? Perfume? Shoes? Shoes, yeah. So if they hired her as a shoe model, that would violate the clause if they bought a bunch of shoes. All right. At dinner last night, I was chatting with some students, and they said, our job is to ask some good questions. Got some good ones. I thought it threw a softball this thing that I wouldn't talk about business entities. Someone could ask, tell me about business entities. It's like kind of a log for you. But anyway, thank you very much for listening. Appreciate it.
Okay.
You're going to be introduced right now.
Let's see. I'm so sorry. I thought this was going to work. Let's see.
There should be a small camera icon at the bottom of the screen whenever you mouse over it. If you hit that. Like a camera.
There is not, unfortunately.
Okay. Whenever you roll the mouse over the screen, do you see no icons?
I see hello everybody. I see a microphone, a red phone, and a plus sign, and a little chat sign.
Do you have a camera connected?
I do, yes.
Okay. If you don't see the camera icon, I'm not sure what I can do to get you going.
Tell her to check preferences.
If you go into your Skype preferences.
Yes, Skype preferences, yes.
Go to video.
Audio, video.
Okay.
Camera, it says no camera.
Try plugging and unplugging the USB. Is it USB or built in?
Is it laptop or is this a separate camera?
This is a laptop.
Is it Mac?
Is it a Macintosh?
It is, yes.
Zachary, do you have Photo Booth open? Hey, Zachary, it's Josh. Can you try opening Photo Booth? There's an app called Photo Booth. Can you open that, please?
Yes,
Okay. When you open that, do you see your camera?
I do.
And you see yourself?
I do.
Okay, so...
I tested that this, yeah.
Okay, so what I suggest is closing Skype. We'll call you back. Your webcam is working, but it's not connected to Skype at the moment.
Okay.
Okay, so let's just hang up, and Terry will call you back in a minute, and just close Skype and maybe reboot or something. We'll go back in 2 minutes, okay?
Okay, I'll reboot.
Thanks,
Yep.
Zephyr. First time on this. Yeah, usually what happens is Photo Booth takes over. Exactly. So if you're running Photo Booth, it basically occupies the camera. So if you reboot, it goes right into Skype. I've had this happen before. No, the problem is you open a Photo Booth. That's exactly what it does.
Yeah, but since it's really 3 minutes.
What you do is actually just order it for the cable through it. I didn't realize how when you're high up, you can't get the knowledge. Just give her a minute, wait for her to sign that. Let's try it. The problem is when you open up Photo Booth, it actually commandeers your web camera, and that's the reason why that happened. So
I was checking it.
I knew exactly. No, I've done the same thing before. Anyway, Samantha, your introduction.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, I'm sorry for the delay, and I'm absolutely thrilled that this was able to work out, and I'm really sorry that I was not able to be there in person. Not only because it's a fascinating subject, but I could spy on the conversations between Josh and Andy and Seth, and learn what we're going to hear in oral argument in a few weeks. But I can now actually tell you why I was not able to be there, and I want to really thank the members of the Law Review and Adam and Frank and others for being understanding. It actually relates to the broad topic of corruption. I'm a fellow at an organization called the Open Markets Institute. I'm very involved in the Open Markets Institute. I'm getting a feedback loop. Are you getting feedback or no? Okay.
So let's turn the microphone off up there. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
I don't like the sound of my own voice that much. Hello?
Is that better?
Let me try.
How's that?
I think that's going to work better, yeah. I still hear a little bit. Anyway, as you may have seen, some of you may have seen in the news, Google, it's an organization that focuses on anti-monopoly and had been talking about Google and Facebook. And Google recently put its elbow down, and we got kicked out this summer of the New America Foundation. So I have been deeply involved in that exit, and I'm really sorry that I could not be there with you right now. Learn from Andy get to see Seth, who I've actually never met in person, although we've seen each other on Skype before. It's really a fantastic lineup that you've got. So I'm still getting feedback, just for what it's worth. So what I want to talk about today, I'll muscle through the feedback. You guys are hearing?
Zapper, turn your audio off.
Really?
Yeah, you don't need to hear us now. Turn your audio off, it'll be good. Trust me on this. Mute your computer and just talk to us.
You can still hear me?
Yeah, we're fine.
You can hear me?
Yep.
Do a thumbs up. Now I truly am talking to myself. All right. All right. So what I understand is that Andy was going to spend some time talking about the emoluments part of the emoluments clause, and Seth and I may not agree on much, but one of the things I think we agree on is that the emoluments clause and the domestic emolument clause are somewhat oddly titled. As you know, the Constitution doesn't come with titles, with names for each particular clause. And we might do better to call what we call the domestic emoluments clause the presidential compensation clause. And I have previously called the, what we now talk about as the emoluments clause, the foreign gifts clause. And that is what I'm going to focus on today, is the presence part of the what we now call the foreign emoluments clause, because of course this clause doesn't merely prohibit accepting emoluments. It prohibits accepting titles of nobility, offices, and presents from foreign powers. And what I want to do today is sort of step back from both litigation and from the particular questions about our current president, and make an argument about why this clause is a well-designed clause to deal with really fundamental threats of corruption in a democratic society. And I want to contrast it, use the other current event happening today, which is the Bob Menendez corruption trial. Since I can't hear any feedback, this is tough. This is like teaching without knowing whether there's any nodding. Have any of you been following the Senator Menendez's corruption trial? Okay, at least a few hands. This is a big deal. It's very rare to have a senator on trial on federal bribery charges. There's only been a handful of federal bribery prosecutions of senators in American history. And argue that there are basically two kinds of rules, two kinds of anti-corruption laws that we have in our anti-corruption armory, and that the emoluments clause, both are necessary, but the emoluments clause representing a prophylactic kind of rule instead of an intent-based rule is going to be a more important kind of rule in addressing the really fundamental threats of corruption that any democratic society faces. So I study corruption law both in the criminal and civil arena. That means white-collar crime, the emoluments clause, citizens united, and the contract law of corruption. And what is really fascinating and interesting about corruption law is that so much of what we either outlaw or forbid or ban, whether in a civil sense or in a criminal sense, in anti-corruption law, are behaviors and practices that we praise and laud in some circumstances and condemn in others. So they're not behaviors which we think of as neutral in some circumstances and then outlaw, but we actively encourage these kinds of behaviors in some circumstances and actively discourage them in others. So Professor Daniel Hayes Lowenstein some time ago said, a concept of corruption means identifying as immoral or criminal a subset of transactions or relationships within a set that is fundamentally beneficial to mankind. And that's what one of the things that makes corruption law so interesting. So this is particularly highlighted in the context of gifts, although you could also argue that this raises some of these same questions in the context of emoluments. So there is no a priori difference between what we call a gift and a bribe. Different cultures at different times have had different rules about the relationships between gifts and bribes. Whether we call a gift, a present, corrupt, or something we should praise depends entirely upon cultural and political norms. So gifts are often what we see as best in society. We praise people for being generous, for being gift givers. Gifts are a way that we express a kind of emotional relationship, a kind of connection, a non-transactional kind of a relationship that actually cements bonds of community. They lead to warmth in a way that no contract can. So this is the sort of positive side of gifts. And then in corruption law, they play a particularly dangerous role. They create obligations, unspoken obligations, non-contractual, emotional kinds of relationships to private parties that can shape judgment and outcome. So an essential part of designing a political system is separating good gifts from dangerous gifts, defining what gifts ought to be corrupting and what gifts ought not to be. In the history of Anglo-American law, this starts with two kind of categories, the extortion area and the bribery area of law. And there's always been this kind of awkward relationship between corruption law and democracy, honestly. Because if you look at the sort of two deep roots of modern corruption law, extortion law developed out of concerns about officers of the king basically demanding more payment than they were due for doing their basic job. And bribery law develops out of judicial law, of judges. So early extortion law is about officers of the king, non-elected officers of the king. Early bribery law is about judges. Now, in both of those instances, you see that there's pretty early clear rules against accepting gifts without necessarily requiring any show of intent. These are kind of bright line rules, like the early judicial bribery rules say you can't take anything except a little bit of meat or drink if you're a judge. We just don't want to have these kinds of interactions with litigants. We don't want to investigate whether that litigant was giving you a nice pile of money in order to get a favor. We just don't want you to take that gift, period. It's a bright line rule because we realize that's going to create a kind of relationship that we don't like. So I think of these as the early anti-bribery, anti-extortion laws were actually bright line rules. That's changed in modern times. When I think of these two kinds of rules that have developed out of those early extortion and bribery laws, there's the prophylactic rule and the intent-based rule. The easiest way to understand this is like by comparing it to speed limits. Do any of you remember Montana's old speed limit law? Who is that in the back who keeps raising their hand? I can't hear. But tell me about this, right? Is that Andy? I can't see. I have hear no, see no, do no evil. That's my. But as I understand it, Montana's old speed limit law is you can't drive dangerously. Can you nod vigorously to see if I have that correct? Now, most of us are used to other kinds of speed limit laws. They say you can't drive above 65 miles an hour, above 70 miles an hour, 55 miles an hour. So we aren't used to the cop. You do not need to worry about me at 72 miles an hour. We have these bright line rules that say you just can't speed over 65, even if you are safe. In fact, even if 90% of people who drive at 72 miles an hour are going to be safe, we're just not going to allow that. Because those 5% of people who might be unsafe at that speed are going to be a risk to all of us. So we're just going to have this absolute rule. Montana's old rule is the other kind of rule. It says, we're going to have the cop in that case, or ultimately the jury, make a determination about what constitutes dangerous driving. And speed would be one element that would go into considering whether that was dangerous or not, but you're going to make a case-by-case determination about whether that driver was dangerous. So one of the things that we see is that our framers were more focused on the prophylactic rules, and I would argue we should return to that prophylactic approach, to the 65 mile an hour speed limit approach towards fighting corruption. And our modern anti-corruption law has moved far more in the Montana direction of trying to decide in any particular case whether something is corrupt. So let's look at what the framers, why they were so focused on this, why they brought this approach. I think history really helps to give some context. You have this new country coming out of in the shadow of these two national powers of France and Britain. And for the framers, France and Britain they were both corrupt, but they represented two very different kinds of corruption. Britain was really seen as a failed republic. As Patrick Henry said, look at Britain, the finest fabric that history, I'm botching the quote, that history has ever reared, rent by corruption. This extraordinary, almost made it story. We got so close, but it was torn apart by internal corrosion and corruption. The French, I think we're seeing as just, louche, essentially corrupt, fundamentally weak characters, cared about luxury, the French were populated, in the framers' view, by weak subjects, flatterers, courtiers. And so, because they saw these two, they were afraid of the infection of either one of these models of corruption. Thomas Jefferson said of France, we have so many other by-interests, what we now call conflict of interest, by-interests, that someone or other will always be bought off. So we don't even want to be infected by that French culture. John Adams said, there is everything here which can seduce, betray, deceive, corrupt, and debauch. Now, if he were tweeting, this probably wouldn't go over very well with foreign relations. So this is France and the cesspool. But the greater tragedy then is of course, and the fear that they really tried, they had something, but they lost it. So we have to then create new rules that will protect against that. At the same time, there's this kind of tension because you want to engage, you want to not be like these two countries, but Lord, you need to have some international relationships with these countries, otherwise we're not going to make this as a young country ourselves. Like this, trade relationships are absolutely essential. The other background fear and understanding how they came to their approach towards corruption is understanding their relationship to Rome. And this is a highly intimate relationship. When in 1776, the year that we declared independence, Gibbon published volume 1 of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. In 1778 and 79, while the Constitution's coming into effect, he published his last installments, the 4th, 5th, and 6th volumes. So during this post-revolutionary, pre-constitutional period, Rome is falling apart as far as the framers are concerned because they're reading installments of Gibbon, just like Days of Our Lives. This is sort of deeply intimate. As John Adams said, that when he was reading Gibbon, he felt like he was reading a story of my own times. And as one historian said, the founding fathers scrutinized the decline of Rome as if it were an autopsy. This sort of deep investigation. And the story that Gibbon tells of Rome is not dissimilar to the story that they understood about the country that they had just left behind. It was a story of pretty good structures that were then rent apart, not from outside, but by internal corruption. And I mean, to me, I always go back to human nature. You start with human nature, you end with human nature. And that a lot of the arguments about the kind of anti-corruption rules we want depend on your view of human nature. And the framers had an understanding of human nature that was more closely aligned to Montesquieu than Hobbes, an understanding that we all have the capacity within ourselves, or most of us, maybe not all, capacity within ourselves to be public-oriented, to love the public, to treat the public as sort of sentimentally central. We also have the capacity to be completely self-interested in public affairs. And so it is the job of creating a society to create structures that make it more likely that our public-facing sentiments will come out and less likely that our private-facing sentiments will come out. That we contain great possibilities within ourselves. And this is as opposed to one model, which is all men are angels, which they clearly didn't think, and the other model, which is all people are essentially self-oriented at all times, and structures don't make a difference. So the way we orient ourselves affects things. I always think of that in terms of, say, like the modern jury, is that we see these extraordinary people, or we see regular people brought into a structure, and jurors rarely, fall asleep, ignore rules, don't pay attention. They're brought into a role and supported in the role of paying deep attention and being, as civic representatives of all of us. And we expect and encourage the kind of systems that will allow jurors to do that. We don't think, you got to worry about those jurors being too self-interested while they're in trial, because in fact the structures support them being publicly focused. This is the deep context. You got the cesspool of France, the failure of Great Britain, and then the days of our lives of Rome. And so it's 1785, and Benjamin Franklin is leaving France, the cesspool, after years of representing American interests there. And you got to remember, Franklin is both loved and people are kind of suspicious of him. He's got a following, but there's others. His enemies call him the most corrupt of all corrupt men, and that corrupt old fox. So Franklin then gets from Louis XVI this gold box-like thing as a parting gift. On it, there's a portrait of the king with red cheeks and powdered hair, lace around his throat, and the portrait is surrounded by 408 embedded diamonds of a beautiful, the highest quality diamond. In fact, some people think this might have been the most valuable thing in Franklin's whole estate. So this gift that in itself represents the tension between the old European way and what Americans wanted. Because this kind of gift, this was routine for diplomats getting gifts from foreign powers when they left office. They routinely got these kind of gifts. This is just the way the world worked. In fact, Wickford said it was such a practice that it was considered the law, almost the law of nations, that there was this kind of gift exchange. And you can remember we talked about why gifts can be positive. You can see why, because these gifts actually enabled a kind of enabled trade, enabled a kind of softening of the relationships between different diplomats. It enabled good relationships. It's a very positive story. But in the United States, this signified something dangerous because it signified the potential threat to corrupt somebody like Franklin. And when they were talking about corrupting Franklin, they weren't saying that we have evidence that Franklin had a secret deal with Louis XVI, where he was going to represent French interests. We know there's a smoking gun. It's just that this is the kind of thing that might shape how Franklin then approaches foreign affairs. Very in American life might approach foreign affairs. So this is, of course, pre-constitutional, and Franklin is subject to a clause in the Articles of Confederation, which is the precursor to this clause. The 1781 provision said, nor shall any person holding any office of profit or trust, the U.S. or any of them, accept any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind. This provision was fairly close. There's some interesting differences, which I'm not going to get into. A copy of a Dutch rule, 1651 Dutch rule. The Dutch rule said, foreign ministers not allowed to take any presents, directly or indirectly, in any manner or any way, whatever. There's a few things that are interesting about the Dutch rule. One is that it was made fun of by the other Europeans. So the international scholar who I mentioned earlier, Rick Fort, said it's like, who do we think we are? Trying to create Plato's Republic and the Fens and Marshes? You know, why are we trying to create a ban on something when everybody else gives gifts with foreign ministers? I also think it's interesting because Amsterdam, 1651, what do you imagine? I know this is hard, but since I can't hear you, I'm sure you're all shouting out. Global trade. But, you know, Amsterdam in the 17th century is very much at the center of global trade, and you can see this provision in some ways as especially interesting to think of it then with the United States now being at the center of global trade, see this provision as especially important for Amsterdam to protect against all the kinds of foreign interactions, the presence that could come and go with foreign ministers, given that they were at the center of international trade. Okay, so this provision is there, and while there's no congressional requirement in the Articles of Confederation provision, it was practice that later became embedded in the constitutional practice, and also, by the way, practice for the Dutch, and this then became embedded in the ultimate constitutional provision that we now call the Emoluments Clause. And I actually think this congressional sort of check is a really interesting part of the clause. So you have a bright line rule about presents, emoluments, offices, and titles, but on the other hand, you say, but look, we're going to allow, it's not an absolute ban, we're going to allow these things to happen, but the correct procedure for allowing that is going through Congress. And what that does then is it breaks the relationship